Welcome to Tabo Eminent channel. For centuries, people living in the far north knew that something invisible yet powerful separated the frozen Arctic from the more temperate lands below. They felt it in the sudden plunges of temperature, in the biting winds that arrived without warning, and in the deep snows that followed. But it wasn't until the early 20th century that scientists began to understand that this invisible boundary had a name, the Arctic Front, and that it was one of the most influential forces shaping the weather of the Northern Hemisphere. The story begins in the years following World War I, in a small group of weather stations across Scandinavia. Thanks for watching. Request you to subscribe. The channel. Norwegian meteorologists, led by Wilhelm Bjerknes and his son Jacob, were pioneering a new way to understand the atmosphere. Before their time, weather forecasting was mostly based on observation and guesswork. But the Bjerknes team realized that the atmosphere could be studied like a fluid, with boundaries, flows, and waves. Around 1918, they introduced the polar front theory, which described how warm and cold air masses met and gave birth to storms. As their research expanded northward, scientists began to notice something even more dramatic above the polar regions. A line marking the edge of the truly Arctic air so cold and dense that it behaved differently from anything farther south. This was the Arctic Front, a colder, sharper boundary that sometimes dipped far enough south to unleash brutal cold waves across Europe, Asia, and North America. By the 1930s, meteorologists had begun charting its movements, trying to understand why the line sometimes stayed locked near the Arctic Circle, and other times surged southward with deadly force. During World War II, the Arctic Front became a matter of life and death. The US, Canada, and the Soviet Union established Arctic observation stations, collecting temperature, wind, and pressure data that would later form the foundation of modern climate science. In those years, the Arctic Front was not just a scientific curiosity, it was a powerful and unpredictable player in global events. For the first time, meteorologists could see the Arctic Front from above, watching as it snaked across the northern oceans and continents, separating worlds of ice from lands of rain and sun. They learned that the front wasn't fixed, it moved with the seasons, dipping southward in winter and retreating north in summer. Its movements explained the dramatic, cold snaps that sometimes swept across the United States, or the fierce snowstorms that blanketed Europe with little warning. In the earliest days of weather observation, long before satellites or radar, the Arctic was a realm of mystery. Sailors who ventured into the northern seas told stories of sudden storms and deadly freezes that seemed to appear from nowhere. Fishermen off the coast of Norway and whalers near Greenland knew that when the wind shifted and the sea mist turned to ice, it meant that the breath of the Arctic had arrived. What they didn't know was that they were witnessing the movement of the Arctic Front, a shifting line of power that divided the world of warmth from the kingdom of cold. The scientific story began in the early 1900s, when a new generation of meteorologists began to think of the atmosphere as a battlefield of air masses. At the Bergen School of Meteorology in Norway, Wilhelm Bjerknes and his students studied how warm and cold air collided to create storms. Their discoveries led to the polar front theory, which explained why storms followed certain paths and why they could intensify so suddenly. But as they peered further north, they realized that there was another, even colder boundary, a front that separated the true Arctic air, borne over ice and snow, from the less frigid polar air to the south. This was the Arctic Front, a hidden wall of cold that could reshape entire weather systems when it moved. By the 1930s, meteorologists across Europe and North America were tracking this front with growing fascination. In the United States, scientists at the New Weather Bureau watched how Arctic air sometimes plunged southward, turning the Great Plains into a frozen wasteland overnight. In 1936, one of the coldest winters on record swept across the continent, freezing rivers solid and crippling cities, all driven by the Arctic front's deep descent. Newspapers called it the Arctic invasion, but to scientists, it was a lesson in the raw power of the atmosphere. Weather could decide battles, and both the Allies and Axis powers raced to understand the Arctic's moods. Secret weather stations were built on remote islands like Spitsbergen and Greenland, staffed by men who endured months of darkness to record temperatures and winds. Their data revealed that the Arctic front wasn't a fixed line. It pulsed and wandered, shaped by ocean currents, the jet stream, and the changing seasons. Sometimes it crept south slowly, bringing steady cold. Other times it crashed downward in a violent rush, unleashing blizzards that halted armies and grounded planes. After the war, a new age of technology dawned. For the first time, scientists could see the Arctic front curling and bending across the globe like a living thing. It was mesmerizing, a shimmering ribbon separating two worlds. But the story took a dramatic turn in the late 20th century. The Arctic began to warm faster than any other place on Earth. Ice that had held for centuries started to melt, exposing dark waters that absorbed more heat. The once stable Arctic air mass grew weaker and patchier. This paradox puzzled many. How could global warming lead to colder winters in some regions? But the answer lay in the weakening of the polar jet stream, the high-altitude wind that flows along the Arctic front. As the temperature difference between Arctic and mid-latitude air narrowed, the jet stream lost strength, meandering more wildly. Today, the Arctic front stands at a crossroads. It still marks the meeting of two worlds, the frozen north and the temperate south, but its boundaries blur more with each passing decade. Scientists warn that as the Arctic continues to warm, the front may retreat farther north, bringing fewer but more chaotic cold events. For those who study the weather, the Arctic front is not just a scientific concept. It's a living reminder of how the smallest shifts in the planet's balance can ripple across continents. From the whalers who felt its bite in the 1800s, to the meteorologists who charted its path through war and peace, to the climate scientists watching it now from satellites orbiting hundreds of miles above Earth, the Arctic front's story is one of power, mystery, and change. It remains one of nature's great dividing lines, a frontier not of land, but of air, and as our world warms, its story is far from over.